great things about going to the coin conventions is talking to the dealers and finding some really cool coins. I talked to David McCarthy of Kagins, who had some pennies. Actually, they're not pennies, they're called cents, from the wartime era that were really valuable and really cool.
I'm a fan of cool coins. I'm obsessed with them. And you know, one of the coins at this show that got a lot of press was the 1943 bronze cent that was sold at Heritage. I think it was the very first one that was discovered, and I think that was sort of the big story going into this show. And I happen to have another one of those here with me that's a very interesting piece. It's a 1943 S copper penny in a PCGS 55 holder with a gold CAC sticker on it, which is kind of a cool thing. The 43S is interesting because there are only 6 of them versus about 15 of the 43P. And while we talk an awful lot about these coins, and you know, the 43 copper pennies are one of the classic American numismatic rarities, we really don't talk very much about their history, which is really a fascinating thing. You know, during World War II, the United States government didn't have a sufficient strategic stockpile of metals, and so when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in late 1941, we, I think, had strategic reserves of about a fifth of the metals that we needed to actually be actively involved in a war. And the consequence of that was that the U.S. government contacted the mint and said, you know, there are certain metals that you really need to take out of coins. The very first of those was tin, and then shortly thereafter they informed them that they were going to have to reduce the amount of copper that they were using. And copper was obviously making up the vast majority of the composition of the penny. And so in 1942, there were a series of experiments with the idea that the mint was going to replace copper in the penny with maybe some sort of metal or maybe plastic or glass. And there are a whole fascinating variety of plastic and glass experimental tokens that were struck by private companies all over the United States. And in addition to that, there were a number of metal patterns that were actually made within the mint, most of which didn't survive. And I've always been fascinated with this era of US numismatics. It's one of the last great experimental eras. And the story is really interesting, and we don't know all of the pieces of it. Some of this stuff is really incredibly rare. And a few years ago, one of the experimental pieces sold in an auction. It was one of the glass pennies, the only unbroken glass penny, and it actually went to a good friend of mine and a client of mine. And I was contacted shortly thereafter by a dealer who had another experimental piece from the 1942 experiments, who said, you know, I know this went to a friend of yours. Maybe you could offer this coin to him. And I took this 1942 tin cent and offered it to my client, and he wasn't really interested, and it kind of dragged on for a while, and the person who had lent me the coin to offer to him got a little bit upset, and you know, I said, well, you know, I'll tell you what, I'll buy it for myself, for my collection, because I think it's a wonderful thing. And the history of the coin is interesting. It came out in the 1950s from King Farouk, and was always identified as being some sort of a metallurgical trial. The problem with that is it's a Lincoln cent and it's struck in tin. Well, the very first metal that was actually removed from coins in 1942 was tin, so they wouldn't have been experimenting using tin at the time. And so that fact kind of put a little pall over the coin, and some people suggested that it was some sort of an error. Other people who knew about the coin said, well, you know, it's just regular dies, it's not that important. And I started looking at the coin really carefully and noticed that it had a very, very wide border, unusually wide, such that whoever prepared the die would have had to take a die and actually put it on a lathe and increase the width of the border. So it's actually so wide that it cuts into the letters in the design. And when I saw that, I realized, well, obviously this isn't an error, and also it's not a regular die, and that makes it very, very interesting, because after about 1909, you really don't see any patterns getting out of the mint from, you know, pattern dies, from experimental dies. And I started looking at it a little bit more carefully and noticed that, you know, Lincoln's portrait and the letters really stood up off of the surface of the coin a lot more than I'd ever seen on another Lincoln set, and the basining, which is sort of the curvature of the die, was really vastly different from any Lincoln set I'd ever seen, and realized that the coin was actually struck from a die that was high relief, which means that they would have had to make a new hub. And it was fascinating to me. I'd never heard anything about a high relief Lincoln cent before. And you know, I decided to try to do some research. I got Roger Burdett's book about the experiments of 1942 and 1943, and I carefully read through the entire section on the U.S. metal experiments and got nowhere. And only by chance opened the book up to a section on the plastic cents and found a memo from the chief engraver of the mint, John Sinek, to the superintendent of the mint, talking about a die that he had made that had a wider border, a 3/100ths of an inch wide border. So I measured the border on this, and what do you know? It was 3/100ths of an inch. And suddenly the story behind this piece kind of fell together. It turns out that while they were making the experimental cents, one of the companies that they had striking plastic cents contacted them and gave them suggestions for improving the Lincoln cent dies so that they could be used for injection molding of plastic. And so they began making what ultimately became the War Series pattern dies, which no one's ever seen a coin struck from. But this is in fact a coin that was made as an experimental piece in October of 1942. There's substantial mint correspondence about this project. It's legitimately a pattern. These dies are actually made, the obverse die at least, is actually made from a completely different Lincoln hub, and in addition to that, it's got different design features. It's got a wider border. So it was kind of an interesting turn of events. You know, sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be smart, and this is one of those cases. So it's something that I've actually put into my collection, and you know, it's one of my very favorite coins that I own, and you know, I just got it back here.
What kind of value?
I have absolutely no idea. There are only two of them known. This piece is a 65. There's a 64 out there, and that's it. And I could throw numbers out there, but I'd just be making stuff up.
Six figures?
Well into six figures, I would expect.